Our tiny office clerk is home, my dad quipped as I stepped right in. His buddy, a Navy SEAL, just spotted my Unit 77 tattoo. His chuckle vanished. Sir, he told Dad, don't you know who your daughter is? Before turning to me, Admiral Callahan, ma'am, it's an honor. Can you imagine a lifetime of being underestimated, dismissed by the one person whose pride you craved the most? I did. I was a rear admiral commanding one of the most covert units in U.S. Special Operations, and my own father still called me his little office clerk. But that all changed the day a young SEAL commander, Jacob Rains, walked into our family barbecue. What happened next? Well, it wasn't quiet. I'm Admiral Alexander Callahan, 44 years old, and my life has been one long fight to prove myself. My father, Edward Callahan, a retired Navy logistics officer, was a man who believed real service happened boots on the ground, steel on target. Everything else, just support work. I was 8 when he told me the military was no place for women who couldn't handle combat. Guess what? I was 22 when I proved him wrong and joined anyway. He signed my enlistment papers with the same neutral expression he used for requisition forms. I think he expected me to wash out or maybe just settle into some safe administrative role. At 23, I commissioned as an ensign, top of my class. He attended the ceremony, sure, but left early for a retirement luncheon. It stung, but I told myself it didn't matter. My early years were a blur of intelligence work, tracking enemy movements, connecting dots no one else saw. By 26, I was a lieutenant. By 30, a lieutenant commander. I learned the language of SEALs and recon Marines. I learned they didn't take me seriously until I'd proven myself 3 times over. At 33, I landed a command in Bahrain. My father, bless his heart, called it desk work in the desert. I could hear a Padres game in the background when he said it. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him my desk work involved coordinating real-time intel for strike packages hitting high-value targets. I didn't mention the commendation I got for preventing a massacre. He wouldn't have understood. Or maybe he would have, and that was somehow worse. By 37, I was a commander. I wasn't just analyzing threats anymore. I was shaping operations. I worked in classified spaces, my name off the public rosters. When I sent him a photo of my promotion ceremony, he texted back, "Congrats. Your mother would have been proud." My mother died when I was 19. She was the one who said I could do anything. My father was the one who believed I shouldn't. Then, at 40, Unit 77 found me. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was a joint task force specializing in clandestine recovery, hostage rescue, downed pilots. We pulled people out of places no one else could reach. I was the executive officer. My commanding officer told me I had a rare combination, operational intuition and bureaucratic patience. You know how to fight and how to wait. 18 months later, I took command. At 41, I was promoted to captain, the rank that separates career officers from those destined for flags. My father? Doctor's appointment, I can't reschedule. My second in command, Captain Lopez, stood in. She asked if I was okay. I said I was. I think I even believed it. I spent the next 2 years running operations across 3 continents, sleeping 4 hours a night, living out of a secure facility that smelled like recycled air and bad coffee. My father called twice. Once to ask if I could help his neighbor's son get into the Naval Academy. I couldn't. The other time, to tell me about a reunion where someone's son had just made SEAL Team 6. Now that's a real accomplishment, he said. I told him I had a briefing. It wasn't a lie. At 43, I made Rear Admiral lower half. A Pentagon ceremony, a speech from the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. My father sent flowers. The card read, "Congratulations on your promotion. Still can't believe they let you get this far." I kept it for 2 weeks. Then I threw it away. 6 months later, another promotion, Rear Admiral Upper Half. Fewer than 1% of officers ever see this rank. I was 44, the youngest woman in Naval Special Warfare Command to hold the position. Unit 77 was still mine, but my role shifted to strategic oversight. More briefing rooms, fewer operations centers. Necessary work, but not the kind my father understood. He still called once a month. Short, surface-level conversations. He'd ask if I was fine. I'd say fine. He'd talk about his garden, his poker nights. Never about my work. I never offered. It was a script, a rhythm, because neither of us knew how to break it. I told myself it was enough. I told myself I didn't need his approval. But every time I hung up, I felt that same hollow ache I'd felt at 23, standing in my dress whites while he left early for a luncheon. I sent him money when his pension ran short. I arranged for his roof to be fixed. I made sure he had everything he needed, even though he never asked. It was easier than confronting the truth. I'd spent 2 decades proving myself to a man who would never see me as more than the girl who organized his files. I was an admiral. I commanded one of the most elite units in the U.S. military. And to him, still just someone who shuffled papers. That was the backdrop when I came home on leave last spring. I hadn't been back in almost a year. I told myself it was time. Maybe things would be different. I should have known better. The signs were always there. I just chose not to see them. Or maybe I saw them and convinced myself they didn't matter. My father had a way of diminishing things without seeming cruel. Never raised his voice. Never insulted me directly. He just made it clear, in 1,000 small ways, that what I did wasn't real service. It started when I was a lieutenant. I came home for Thanksgiving, and he introduced me to his poker group as my daughter, the Navy girl. When someone asked what I did before I could answer, he said, "Intelligence analysis. Lots of computers and reports. Not exactly kicking down doors." The men chuckled. I smiled and changed the subject. Later, when I tried to tell him about a commendation, he nodded, "That's nice, sweetheart," then went back to the game. By lieutenant commander, the pattern was set. He'd brag about other people's sons, Marines, pilots, SEALs, with a reverence he never used for me. At a family dinner, he spent 20 minutes on his friend's son, who'd completed BUD/S training. "Now, that's a warrior," he declared. I was sitting right there, fresh off a deployment where I'd coordinated strikes that dismantled an entire terror cell network. I said nothing. How could I compete with his version of heroism? When I made commander at 37, I called him. He was at a hardware store. I could hear forklifts. "That's great, Alex. Really great. Hey, I've got to grab some lumber before they close. We'll talk later." We didn't talk later. 3 weeks passed before he called again, and when he did, he didn't mention the promotion. He asked if I knew someone who could help his buddy's nephew get a job on base. The breaking point should have come earlier, but I kept making excuses. He's old-fashioned. He doesn't understand modern military structure. I rationalized his dismissals as ignorance, not malice. But the truth was simpler and much harder. He didn't respect what I did because he didn't see it as real. When I was promoted to captain at 41, I invited him, sent details 2 months in advance, called to confirm a week before. He said he'd be there. The morning of, he called, "Doctor's appointment. On the books for months. Can't reschedule." I asked what for. Routine. I didn't push. I told him it was fine. Captain Lopez stood beside me. Afterward, she asked if I wanted a drink. "No," I said. I went back to my quarters and stared at the wall for an hour. He called 2 days later to ask how it went. I gave him a brief summary. Well, you've always been good at the administrative side of things, he said. That's a valuable skill. Something cracked inside me, some small piece of hope I didn't know I was still holding. I thanked him and ended the call. I didn't cry. I'd stopped crying over him years ago. The comments continued. Every visit, every phone call, some subtle jab, disguised as humor or an observation. Our little clerk's probably organizing supply chains, he'd say to his friends. Or, Alex does all the behind-the-scenes stuff. Real important work, even if it's not glamorous. He said it with affection, like he was proud of me for knowing my place. I'd smile. What else could I do? Tell him I'd been in firefights, that I'd made calls that put lives on the line, that I'd earned my rank through decisions most people couldn't fathom? He wouldn't have believed me. Or worse, he would have, and it still wouldn't have mattered. By the time I made Rear Admiral lower half, I'd stopped expecting anything. The promotion was significant, a flag officer rank most never reach. He sent flowers with a card that felt like a backhanded compliment. I didn't keep it. I didn't need another reminder that his pride was conditional, his respect reserved for men who fit his narrow definition of service. 6 months later, Rear Admiral, upper half. I didn't tell him until a week after. He sounded surprised. Another promotion? They're really moving you up fast. It wasn't fast, Dad. It was 22 years of work. Well, you always were good at climbing the ladder. Your mother had that same ambition. It wasn't a compliment. It was a dismissal. I let it go. I always let it go. The last conversation before I came home for that barbecue was brief. I called to say I'd be on leave. He sounded pleased. That'd be great, Alex. I'm having a few of the guys over for a barbecue. You should come. It'll be good to see you. I asked who. He rattled off names. Old Navy buddies, some logistics guys. And Jacob Rains, a SEAL commander he'd stayed in touch with. Jake's a hell of an operator, my father said. You'll like him. Real war fighter. I said I'd be there. I hung up and stared at my phone, wondering why I kept doing this to myself. I drove 6 hours. Interstate 95 cutting west toward the Blue Ridge foothills. My father's house was small, a single-story ranch. The driveway was crowded with trucks. I was in dress whites, straight from a ceremony in D.C. No time to change. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a barbecue. My father was in the backyard, near the grill, beer in hand, talking to 3 men. One was younger, late 30s, the build and bearing of someone who still ran 10 miles before breakfast. Rains. My father saw me first. He grinned, raised his beer. Our little office clerk is home, he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. The men turned. A couple chuckled. I forced a smile and kept walking. He met me halfway, pulled me into a one-armed hug. Look at you, all dressed up. Come from a meeting or something? I told him I'd been at a change of command ceremony in D.C. He nodded absently, already turning back to his friends. Guys, this is my daughter, Alex. She's in the Navy. Does all the intel paperwork and coordination. Real brain work. One of the older men shook my hand. Logistics, he asked. Intelligence and special operations. I clarified. He nodded, like he didn't know the difference. Rain stepped forward. Sharp eyes, calm intensity. He extended his hand. Commander Rains, he said, good to meet you, ma'am. Likewise, I replied. My father clapped Rains on the shoulder. Jake here just got back from a rotation overseas. Can't talk about it, but let's just say he's been keeping the bad guys on their toes. Rains smiled politely, said nothing. I liked him immediately. We moved toward the grill. My father handed me a beer, and the conversation shifted to sports, the weather. The usual safe topics people default to when they're not sure what to say. I stood at the edge of the group, half listening, trying to decide how long I needed to stay before I could make an excuse and leave. That's when Rains saw the tattoo. It was on my left forearm, just below the sleeve of my dress whites. A trident with the number 77 beneath it, small and precise. I'd gotten it years ago, when Unit 77 was new, and we were still figuring out what we were. A stupid decision. In hindsight, officers aren't supposed to get unit tattoos. But I was younger then, and it felt important. I'd kept it covered ever since, but dress whites have short sleeves. No hiding it. Rains was mid-sentence when he saw it. He stopped talking. His expression shifted from casual to something else. Recognition. Disbelief. He stared at my arm for a long moment, then looked up at my face, then back at the tattoo. Unit 77, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded. That's right. The yard went quiet. My father looked between us, confused. What's Unit 77? Rains didn't answer. He was still staring at me, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He was putting pieces together. My rank, my age, the tattoo, the fact that I'd just come from a ceremony in D.C. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, almost hesitant. "Sir," he said, turning to my father, "do you know who your daughter is?" My father blinked. "What do you mean?" "She's Alex. She works in intelligence." Rains shook his head slowly. He turned back to me, and I saw the exact moment he made the connection. His posture shifted. He straightened, his hands dropping to his sides. And when he spoke again, it was with the formal tone of someone addressing a superior officer. "Admiral Callahan, ma'am. It's an honor." The silence that followed was absolute. My father's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The other men stared, processing what they'd just heard. One of them, an older guy in a faded Marine Corps t-shirt, looked at me, then at my father, then at Rains. "Admiral," he said. "She's an admiral?" Rains nodded. "Rear Admiral, upper half. And she commands Unit 77. It's a joint task force for clandestine recovery operations, hostage rescue, asset extraction, high-risk intelligence missions. If you've heard about it, you shouldn't have." He looked at me again, and there was something close to awe in his expression. "Ma'am, I worked with your people in Syria 2 years ago. You pulled out 6 of ours when everyone else said it was impossible. I didn't know you were—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. I had no idea. I didn't know what to say." I looked at my father. He was pale, his beer forgotten in his hand. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You're an admiral?" he finally managed. I nodded. "Since last year." He blinked. "But you said you worked in intelligence." "I do," I said. "I also command a special operations task force. I have for the last 3 years." He stared at me like I was speaking a language he didn't understand. Rains stepped back, giving us space, but I could feel his eyes on me. The other men had gone quiet, uncomfortable witnesses to something they hadn't signed up for. My father set his beer down on a nearby table. His hands were shaking, slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I just looked at him. This man who'd spent 2 decades dismissing everything I'd done. I tried. The barbecue didn't recover. Rains and the other men made awkward excuses and left within the hour. They shook my hand with a deference I wasn't used to outside of official settings, offered stiff thank yous for my service. Rains lingered the longest. He pulled me aside near my car. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." I cut him off. "You didn't do anything wrong, Commander. If anything, I should thank you." He nodded, but still looked uncomfortable. "Your father's a good man," he said. "He talks about you all the time." He's proud of you. I didn't correct him. There was no point. When everyone was gone, I went back inside. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. The house was quiet. I stood in the doorway, unsure whether to sit or leave. He looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I didn't recognize in his expression. Not anger, not dismissal. Shame. I didn't know, he said quietly. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. You didn't ask. He flinched, barely perceptible, but I saw it. I thought. He stopped, shaking his head. I thought you were doing admin work. Coordination. I didn't know you were. He gestured vaguely, unable to finish. A flag officer? I offered. A commander of a special operations unit. Someone who spent the last 20 years doing exactly what you said women couldn't do. He looked away. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't take them back. Every time I tried to tell you what I did, you changed the subject. Every time I came home, you introduced me as your clerk. You dismissed every promotion, every deployment, every piece of my career like it didn't matter. So, no, Dad, you didn't say it, but you made it very clear. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. I didn't mean to. He stopped again, struggling. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I didn't make a big deal out of it, you wouldn't get hurt when things didn't work out. I stared at him. Things did work out. I'm an admiral. I've done things most people will never even hear about. And you weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. He didn't argue. He just sat there, this man who'd spent his whole life believing he understood how the world worked, realizing maybe he didn't. I thought about leaving, about walking out and never coming back. But there was something in his face, some small crack in the armor he'd worn for so long, that made me stay. Why didn't you come to my ceremonies? I asked. Why didn't you ever ask what I actually did? He rubbed his face with both hands. I don't know, he said. I guess I was scared. Of what? Of realizing I was wrong about you. The admission hung in the air. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to absolve him, to say it was okay. But it wasn't okay. 20 years of dismissal couldn't be erased with a single moment of honesty. I need to go, I said, standing. He looked up, panicked. Alex, wait. I'm not leaving forever. I said, I just need some air. I walked out to the porch and sat on the steps. The sun was starting to set. I thought about every time he'd introduced me as his clerk, every time he'd bragged about someone else's son, every time he'd made me feel less than. And I thought about Rains, the way his expression had shifted, the way he'd straightened and called me ma'am. It was the first time my father had ever seen someone treat me with the respect I'd earned. He came out 10 minutes later and sat beside me. We didn't speak for a while. Finally, he said, I'm sorry. I didn't look at him. For what specifically? For not seeing you, he said. For not understanding what you were doing. For making you feel like it didn't matter. I nodded slowly. Okay. That's it, he asked. Just okay. I turned to face him. What do you want me to say? That it's fine? That I forgive you? I don't know if I do yet. You spent 2 decades treating me like I was playing pretend. Do you have any idea what that felt like? He shook his head. No, I don't. Then give me time, I said. Give me time to figure out if I can get past this. He nodded. We sat in silence for a while longer. Then he said, Unit 77. That's really what you command? Yes. And you've been doing this for how long? 3 years in command. But I've been working in special operations for over a decade. He let out a long breath. Jesus, Alex, I had no idea. I know, I said, and that was the problem. I didn't see my father for 3 months after that. We spoke on the phone twice, short, stilted conversations. He'd ask how I was. I'd say fine. He'd ask if I was safe. I'd tell him as much as I could, which wasn't much. He didn't press. It was progress, I suppose, but it didn't feel like enough. Word spread quickly through the veteran community in his town. My father told me later that within a week, everyone knew. The man who'd spent years dismissing his daughter's career suddenly found himself fielding questions about what it was like to raise a flag officer. He handled it poorly at first, tried to deflect, to downplay, but the men he'd served with weren't stupid. One of them, a retired Marine colonel, cornered him at a VFW meeting. "Ed, you've been telling us for years your daughter pushes papers. Meanwhile, she's out there running missions most of us couldn't even dream of. What the hell were you thinking?" My father didn't have an answer. He called me that night, and for the first time in my life, he sounded small. "They all know," he said. "Everyone's talking about it." I was in my office, reviewing mission briefs for an operation in the Horn of Africa. I sat down my pen, and I feel like an idiot. "You should," I said. It wasn't kind, but it was true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I started reading about Unit 77. There's not much out there, but I found some articles, some old news reports about missions that weren't attributed to anyone. Was that you?" "Some of it," I said. "Most of it you'll never read about." "Why not?" "Because that's how it works, Dad. We don't exist on paper. We do the jobs no one else can do, and then we disappear. That's the point." He let out a long breath. I had no idea. I thought. He stopped. I don't know what I thought. I felt something shift in me then, a small loosening of the anger I'd been carrying. He was trying. It was clumsy and inadequate, but he was trying. "Dad," I said, "I need you to understand something. I didn't do this for recognition. I didn't do it to prove you wrong. I did it because it mattered, because people's lives depended on someone making hard calls. And I was willing to make them. But it would have been nice to know that you saw that you respected it." "I do now," he said. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I do." "Okay," I said. "That's a start." We talked for another 20 minutes. He asked questions, careful, tentative questions about my work, my rank, what it meant to command a unit like 77. I answered what I could. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was the first real conversation we'd had in years. Over the next few months, something changed. He started calling more often, and the calls felt different. He wasn't trying to impress me with stories about other people's accomplishments. He wasn't dismissing what I did. He asked about my day, my deployments, the people I worked with. He still didn't understand most of it, but he was trying to. That mattered. He also started going to therapy. He didn't tell me at first. I found out through a mutual friend. When I asked him about it, he was embarrassed. I figured I should talk to someone. He said, "About what?" "About why I treated you the way I did. About why I couldn't see what was right in front of me." I didn't know what to say. I settled on, "That's good, Dad. I'm glad." I saw the change in other ways, too. He stopped bragging about other people's kids. He stopped introducing me as his clerk. When someone asked what I did, he said, "She's a rear admiral in the Navy, commands a special operations unit." I can't tell you much more than that, but I'm proud of her. The first time I heard him say that, I almost cried. But pride wasn't the same as understanding, and respect wasn't the same as repair. There were still moments when I'd catch him looking at me, like he didn't recognize me, like the daughter he thought he knew had been replaced by someone else entirely. Maybe that was true. Maybe I had changed so much that the girl he remembered didn't exist anymore. Or maybe she never did. I threw myself into work. It was easier than dealing with the mess at home. I had operations to plan, people to protect, missions to execute. Unit 77 ran 3 major operations in those months, all successful. We pulled a kidnapped journalist out of Yemen, extracted a compromised intelligence asset from Eastern Europe, recovered sensitive materials from a downed reconnaissance drone. My people came home. That was all that mattered. Captain Lopez, my second-in-command, noticed I was different. "You okay, ma'am? You seem distracted." I told her I was fine. She didn't believe me. "If you need to talk, I don't," I said. "Then softer." "But thank you." She nodded and went back to the reports, but I could feel her watching me. Lopez was good at reading people. She knew when to push and when to let things go. She let this go. That night, alone in my quarters, I thought about my father. The shame in his eyes, the apology he didn't know how to give, the years I'd spent trying to earn his respect, bending myself into shapes I thought he'd approve of. And I thought about the fact that I'd made it to Admiral without him ever understanding what that meant. Maybe he understood now. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I'd done it. And that had to be enough. The invitation came in late autumn. A formal request from Naval Special Warfare Command for me to attend a change of command ceremony in San Diego. I was handing over Unit 77 to my successor, Captain Elena Park, a brilliant officer I'd mentored for the past 2 years. It was time. I'd been in command for 3 years, and the toll was starting to show. I needed a new challenge. I'd been offered a position as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare, a desk at the Pentagon, a voice in strategic decisions that would shape the Navy for the next decade. I accepted. I called my father to tell him about the ceremony. I didn't expect him to come. San Diego was a long trip, and his health had been declining. But when I asked, he didn't hesitate. "I'll be there," he said. "I wouldn't miss it." I told him he didn't have to. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." The ceremony was scheduled for early December, a crisp Saturday morning at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The sky was clear, the ocean visible, a perfect California day. I arrived early, in service dress blues. I'd done this before, but never as the one letting go. My father arrived an hour before. I saw him from across the parade ground, walking slowly with a cane I didn't know he needed. He was wearing his old service dress uniform, the one he'd kept in a garment bag for 15 years. It fit him differently now, looser in some places, tighter in others. He looked older, smaller, but he stood straight. When he reached me, he saluted. I returned it, then pulled him into a hug. "You didn't have to wear the uniform," I said. "I wanted to," he replied. "Felt right." We didn't have much time to talk before the ceremony began. I introduced him to some of my staff. When Lopez said, "Your daughter's the best commander I've ever served under," he nodded and said, "I'm starting to understand that." The ceremony itself was precise and efficient. Speeches. I talked about service, about the mission, about the extraordinary people I'd led. I didn't talk about my father, but when I looked out at the crowd and saw him standing in the front row, tears streaming down his face, I felt something break open inside me. Afterward, my father and I found a quiet spot near the waterfront. We sat on a bench overlooking the bay. The sound of seagulls and distant boat engines filled the silence. He was the first to speak. I should have known, Lex. It was the first time he called me that in years. My mother used to call me Lex. He'd stopped after she died. "Known what?" I asked. "Who you were, what you were capable of." I should have seen it. I looked out at the water. "Maybe, but you didn't." "I was scared," he said, "of you, of losing you, of you going somewhere I couldn't follow." I turned to face him. I've been going places you couldn't follow for 20 years, Dad. That's the job. He nodded. I know. And I made it worse by pretending I didn't see it, by acting like what you did didn't matter. I thought if I didn't take it seriously, it wouldn't be real. And if it wasn't real, you'd be safe. But I wasn't safe, I said. I was in danger. I've been in danger my entire career. And you never acknowledged it because you couldn't handle it. You're right, he said. And I'm sorry. We sat in silence for a while. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. He handed it to me without a word. Inside was his navy ring, the one he'd worn for 30 years. What's this? I asked. It's yours, he said. I should have given it to you a long time ago. Dad, I can't. Yes, you can, he interrupted. You earned it. You earned it more than I ever did. I held the ring, feeling its weight, scratched and worn, the gold dull. It smelled faintly of metal and salt air. I slipped it onto my finger. It was too big, but I didn't care. Thank you, I said. He nodded, and for a moment I thought we might actually be okay. Not healed, not whole, but something close to understanding. I just never thought they'd let someone like us lead a unit like that, he said quietly. I pulled the ring off and handed it back to him. He looked confused. What? They didn't let me, Dad. I said, I earned it. There's a difference. His face fell. He stared at the ring in his palm, then back at me. I didn't mean, I know what you meant, I said. And that's the problem. You still don't get it. This wasn't about luck or being let in. This was about proving myself every single day for 20 years. It was about being twice as good to get half the credit. It was about making decisions that would have broken most people and doing it without recognition because that's what the job required. He looked down. I'm sorry, Alex. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what you need. I needed a father who believed in me, I said, but I'll settle for one who's trying to understand. It was quiet for a long time. Then he closed his hand around the ring. I'm trying. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I am. I nodded. I know. We sat there until the sun began to set, painting the bay in shades of orange and pink. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was something. A crack in the wall, a possibility. When we finally stood, he offered me his arm. I took it, and we walked back toward the parking lot together. An old man in an outdated uniform, and his daughter, the Admiral. Neither of us quite sure what came next, but willing to find out. The months that followed were a study in reconstruction. I threw myself into my new role at the Pentagon. It was different from commanding Unit 77, less immediate, more abstract, but no less important. My father and I spoke every week. The conversations were still sometimes awkward, still sometimes strained, but they were real. He asked questions about my work. I answered as much as I could. He told me about his therapy sessions. The therapist says I have trouble accepting things I can't control, he said once. She says I tried to make you smaller, so I wouldn't have to worry about you. That sounds about right, I said. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. Yeah, it does. He started reading military history, books about leadership, about women in combat, about the evolution of special operations. He'd call me with questions. It says here that Admiral Grace Hopper invented computer programming languages, he said once. Did you know that? I told him I did. She was a rear admiral, he continued. Just like you. I never knew that. There have been a lot of women doing remarkable things in the military. I said, we've just been doing it quietly. Too quietly, he said. Someone should have told me. I wanted to say I'd tried to tell him, that I'd spent years trying to make him see, but I let it go. He was learning. That had to be enough. In the spring, he came to visit me in Virginia. The first time he'd ever come to see me. I picked him up from the airport. As we drove past the Pentagon, past the memorials, he stared out the window like a tourist. "You work here," he said, more to himself than to me. "You actually work here?" "I do," I said. "What's it like?" I thought about it. Overwhelming, frustrating, rewarding, all at once. I showed him my office. A small space with a window overlooking the river, walls lined with commendations and photos. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. "This is real," he said quietly. "This is actually real." "It always was," I said. He nodded. "I know. I'm starting to understand that." We had dinner that night. Over wine and pasta, he told me about his life, about the things he regretted, about the ways he wished he'd been different. "I was a good logistics officer," he said, "but I was a mediocre father. I see that now." "You weren't mediocre," I said. "You were absent. There's a difference." He flinched, but he didn't argue. "You're right. I was. And I'm sorry." I took a sip of wine, considering my next words. "I used to think that if I just did enough, achieved enough, you'd finally see me. But the problem wasn't what I did. The problem was that you'd already decided who I was. And nothing I accomplished could change that. Until Rains," he said. I nodded. "Until Rains." "I hate that it took someone else telling me for me to believe it," he said. "I hate that I couldn't see it on my own." "So do I said. "But here we are." We finished dinner in relative silence. Afterward, we walked along the Potomac. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, but insisted on walking. "I need to ask you something," he said after a while. "Okay. Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about all the years of dismissal, all the times he'd made me feel invisible. I thought about the girl I'd been, desperate for his approval, and the woman I'd become who'd learned to live without it. "I don't know," I said finally. "Maybe, but forgiveness isn't going to erase what happened. It's not going to give me back the years I spent trying to be enough for you." "I know," he said. "I just needed to hear you say it." We walked in silence for a while longer. Then he said, "For what it's worth, you were always enough. I was just too stupid to see it." It wasn't absolution, but it was honest. And honesty, I was learning, was its own form of repair. My father's health declined over the next year. Congestive heart failure. They gave him 2 years, maybe 3. He wasn't good at following orders. I flew home as often as I could, juggling Pentagon briefings with hospital visits, secure phone calls with bedside conversations. He hated that I was there, hated seeing him weak. "You've got more important things to do than babysit an old man," he'd say. I'd tell him there was nothing more important, and he'd shake his head. But he'd also talk more openly than ever before about my mother, about his own father, about the ways generational trauma gets passed down like heirlooms no one wants but everyone keeps. "My dad never told me he was proud of me either," he said once. I swore I'd be different with my kids, and then I just repeated the same mistakes. "You didn't have to," I said. "I know, but it's easier to repeat what you know than to build something new." He looked at me, his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "You built something new. You broke the pattern." "I had to," I said. "There wasn't another option." He smiled weakly. "You always were stubborn. You got that from your mother." In the fall, I brought Lieutenant Park to meet him. She'd taken command of Unit 77 with the same precision and dedication I'd hoped for. I wanted him to see what came next. He sat in his living room, oxygen cannula in his nose, and listened as Park told him about a recent operation. Classified details stripped away, but the shape of it clear enough. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You're doing good work," he said. "Thank you, sir," Park replied. He turned to me. "You trained her." "I mentored her. She did the work herself. He looked between us, and I saw something like wonder in his face. This is your legacy, he said, not just the missions, the people. I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. The missions would be forgotten, buried in classified archives. But the people, the officers I'd trained, the leaders I'd shaped, they'd carry forward. They were the legacy. By December, he was in hospice. I took emergency leave, moved into his house. 3 days before he died, he had a moment of clarity. He called me over to his bed, his voice barely a whisper. "Lex, I'm here, Dad. I need to tell you something." "Okay." I was wrong about everything. About you. About what mattered. About what makes someone a warrior. You were braver than any of us. You walked into rooms where no one wanted you and made them give you a seat at the table. That's courage. That's real strength. I felt tears burning in my eyes. "Thank you for saying that." "I should have said it 20 years ago," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't." "I know," I said. "I forgive you." He closed his eyes. Then he squeezed my hand and said, "Your mother would be so proud of you." "I am too. I hope you know that." "I do know," I said. He died 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning just after dawn. I was sitting beside him. It was quiet, peaceful, nothing like the way he lived, and maybe that was a mercy. We buried him with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. It took some work. He hadn't served long enough to automatically qualify, and his rank wasn't high enough to guarantee a spot, but I made some calls, pulled some strings. He would have hated that I used my position. He also would have been secretly pleased. The funeral was small. A handful of old Navy friends, some neighbors, a few distant relatives. Captain Lopez came, Lieutenant Park, Commander Raines, who'd stayed in touch after that barbecue. The Navy provided an honor guard. I held the flag in my lap during the chaplain's remarks, feeling its weight, thinking about what it represented. Not just my father's service, but mine. Not just his legacy, but the one I was still building. When the rifle salute fired, I didn't flinch. I'd heard worse sounds in worse places. After the service, people offered condolences. They told me he was a good man, a dedicated officer, a loyal friend. They told me he'd talked about me constantly in his final year, that he'd been so proud. I thanked them, smiled, and played the part of the grieving daughter. And I was grieving, but not just for the man who died. I was grieving for the relationship we never had, for the years we'd wasted, for the understanding that came too late. Raines was the last to approach. He stood at attention. "Admiral, I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Commander." He hesitated. "If it helps," he said. He changed. After that day at the barbecue, he really changed. He spent the last year trying to understand who you were. That's worth something. "It is," I said, "but it doesn't erase the 20 years before it." "No," Raines agreed, "but it counts for something." I nodded. He saluted. I returned it. He walked away, leaving me alone with the flag and the silence. I returned to work a week after the funeral, a backlog of decisions, briefings, meetings. I dove in, channeling grief into productivity, the way I always had. Lopez noticed. "Ma'am, if you need more time." "I don't," I said. "Work is what I need right now." She didn't push, but she watched me carefully. Maybe she was right to worry. I was working 14-hour days, sleeping 5 hours a night, avoiding anything that required me to sit still and feel. It was unsustainable, and I knew it, but sustainable wasn't the point. Surviving was. 2 weeks after the funeral, a package arrived at my office. No return address, just my name and rank in my father's handwriting. Inside was his Navy ring, the one he tried to give me at the change of command ceremony. And beneath it, a note on yellowed paper, the ink slightly smudged. Lex, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't give this to you in person, but you gave it back last time, and I understood why. I didn't earn the right to pass it to you, but I want you to have it anyway, not because of what I did, but because of what you've done. You didn't just meet the standard. You became the standard. I wish I'd told you that more. I wish I'd seen it sooner, but I see it now. You're not my little clerk. You never were. You're Admiral Alexandra Callahan, and you're everything I should have been. Carry this if you want. Leave it in a drawer if you don't. Either way, know that I finally understood who you were. And I was in awe. Dad. I read the note 3 times. Then I slipped the ring onto my finger. It was still too big, but I didn't care. I wore it for the rest of the day, feeling its weight, its history, the complicated legacy it represented. When Captain Lopez noticed, she didn't say anything. She just nodded, a small gesture of understanding. That night, alone in my quarters, I thought about my father, the man he'd been and the man he'd tried to become, the ways we'd hurt each other, and the small grace of his final year. He'd spent 2 decades dismissing me, and 1 year trying to make up for it. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. I thought about my mother, too, the woman who'd believed in me from the beginning, who told me I could do anything. I wished she'd lived to see what I'd become. I wished she'd been there for the promotions, the ceremonies, the moments that mattered. But maybe she had been in some way I couldn't measure or prove. And I thought about the younger officers I'd mentored, Park, and the dozens of others who'd passed through my commands. Women who'd faced the same quiet dismissals, the same subtle undermining, the same impossible standards. I tried to give them what I never had, someone who saw them, who believed them, who cleared the path so they didn't have to fight every battle I'd fought. That was the real work, not the operations or the missions or the classified briefings. The real work was making sure the next generation didn't have to prove themselves the way I had. The real work was changing the culture, one conversation, one decision, one promotion at a time. I pulled out my phone and called Lieutenant Park. She answered on the second ring. "Admiral, is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to check in. How's command treating you?" "It's good, ma'am. Challenging, but good." "That's how it should be," I said. "Elena, I need you to remember something." "Yes, ma'am." "You belong there. You earned that command through years of hard work and dedication. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Not your peers, not your superiors, not anyone." There was a pause. Then quietly, "Did someone make you doubt it, ma'am?" "For a long time," I said. "Too long. Don't make my mistake." "I won't," she said. "I promise." "Good. Carry on, Lieutenant." Ma'am." I hung up and sat in the silence of my quarters, feeling something like peace settle over me. My father had introduced me wrong once. He'd called me his little clerk, dismissed my achievements, refused to see who I'd become. But in the end, he'd seen it. In the end, he'd known. And maybe, after everything, that was enough. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement, the recognition that I'd done something worthy, something that mattered. I'd served quietly for 20 years, and then someone had finally noticed. Not because I demanded it, but because the truth has a way of revealing itself. I looked down at my father's ring, still too big on my finger, and thought about the note he'd left. "You're everything I should have been," he'd written, but he was wrong about that. I wasn't what he should have been. I was what I'd chosen to become. And that distinction mattered. 5 years later, I stood in the same Pentagon office, now a 3-star admiral serving as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. The responsibilities had grown. The decisions had become weightier. but the core of the work remained the same: protecting people, enabling missions, shaping the future of naval warfare. I was 50 now, with more gray in my hair and more lines around my eyes. But I was still here, still serving, still fighting for the things that mattered. Commander Park, as she was now, commanded her own battle group. She'd exceeded every expectation I'd had for her. We spoke regularly, and every conversation reminded me why I'd chosen this path. Not for recognition or glory, but for the opportunity to build something that would outlast me. My father's ring sat in a small wooden box on my desk next to his final note. I didn't wear it anymore. It was too loose, too impractical. But I kept it close. Some days I'd open the box and read the note. Other days I'd leave it closed, focused on the present. The wound he'd left hadn't fully healed. I'm not sure it ever would, but it had scarred over, leaving behind a harder, wiser version of myself. I'd learned that respect couldn't be demanded, only revealed, that some apologies came through changed behavior rather than words, that legacy wasn't about the recognition you received, but about the people you lifted up. On quiet evenings when the Pentagon emptied out, I'd think about that barbecue. My father's joke, "Our little office clerk is home." Commander Rain's response, the look on my father's face. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it had felt like grief. But grief wasn't the end of the story. The end was what came after. The slow rebuilding, the tentative reconciliation, the grace of his final year. He'd spent 2 decades getting it wrong, and 1 year trying to make it right. It hadn't erased the hurt, but it had transformed it into something bearable, something I could carry. I kept his Navy ring as a reminder, not of him, but of the choice I'd made. The choice to serve anyway, to excel anyway, to build a career worth having, even when no one was watching. I'd done it for myself, not for him, but in the end, he'd seen it, and that had mattered more than I'd expected. Now, standing at my office window overlooking the Potomac, I thought about what I'd tell my younger self, if I could. I'd tell her that the validation would come eventually, but not in the way she expected. I'd tell her that she'd spend years proving herself to someone who couldn't see her, and that it would hurt, but it wouldn't break her. I'd tell her that she'd make admiral, that she'd command elite units, that she'd shape the future of naval warfare. And I'd tell her that none of it would mean as much as the moment when her father finally called her by her rank. He'd introduced me wrong once, but in the end, he knew exactly who I was. And maybe after everything, that was enough. 1 year later, I was sitting in a congressional hearing room, testifying about the future of special operations integration. The questions were pointed, the atmosphere tense. My father would have been terrified by this, not because of the stakes. He understood pressure, but because he never would have imagined his daughter in this chair, speaking with authority about national security strategy to people who held the nation's purse strings. The hearing wrapped. I had 30 minutes before my next meeting. I ducked into a quiet corridor and checked my phone. A message from Commander Park. "Ma'am, something you should see." Below it, a link to a military blog post titled "The Invisible Admirals, Women Who Shaped Modern Naval Warfare." I clicked it. My name was there, alongside a dozen others. The article was well-researched, citing recently declassified operations, missions I'd almost forgotten about. It mentioned Unit 77 by name. Apparently, some of our work had finally been cleared for public discussion. The comment section was predictably mixed, half supportive. The other half questioned whether women belonged in combat leadership at all. I closed the browser. Some battles never ended. They just changed shape. That evening, I drove out to Arlington. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Maybe because the hearing had drained me. Maybe because seeing my name in print alongside special operations and classified missions made me think about how long it had taken for anyone to notice. Maybe because I was tired of carrying the weight alone. The cemetery was nearly empty. I found my father's grave easily. Section 60, row C, a simple white headstone with his name, rank, and dates of service. Someone had left a small American flag beside it. I stood there for a long time, hands in my coat pockets, watching the sun set over the rows of white markers. I testified before Congress today. I said, finally, my voice soft against the wind, about special operations reform. They asked hard questions. I gave harder answers. You would have been proud or terrified, maybe both. The wind picked up, cold and sharp. I pulled my coat tighter. I'm wearing 3 stars now. They promoted me last month, Vice Admiral. I'm one of the youngest women to ever hold the rank. I looked down at the headstone. I thought about calling you. Then I remembered you're not there to answer anymore. I waited until a passing groundskeeper was out of sight. I still get angry sometimes. When I think about all those years you didn't see me, when I remember introducing myself at functions and having men assume I was someone's wife, not someone's commander. When I think about how hard I had to work just to be taken half as seriously as my male peers. I crouched down, brushed some leaves off the headstone. But I also remembered that last year. The way you tried. It wasn't enough, but it was something. I stood back up. Commander Raines called me last week. He's retiring, moving to Colorado. He told me that barbecue changed his life, made him look at his own daughter differently, made him realize he'd been making the same mistakes you did. He thanked me. I laughed, short and bitter. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson that day. I was just trying to survive a family dinner. A jet passed overhead. I tracked it until it disappeared. I'm mentoring 6 junior officers right now. All women. All brilliant. All fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight. I'm trying to make it easier for them. Trying to clear the path so they don't have to prove themselves the way I did. I think that's what you were trying to tell me at the end. That the work isn't just the missions, it's the people who come after. The sun was almost gone now. The cemetery sinking into twilight. I forgave you, I said quietly. I'm not sure when it happened exactly. Maybe it was when I read your note. Maybe it was later, when I realized I was carrying your ring in my pocket like a talisman. Maybe it's happening right now, standing here telling you about my life like you can still hear me. I took a breath. You hurt me for a long time, but you also raised me to be resilient, to serve quietly, to do the work without needing applause. You just never realized I'd take those lessons and build something you couldn't imagine. I reached out and touched the cold stone. I miss you, not the version of you that dismissed me, the version from that last year, the one who finally saw me. I wish we'd had more time with that version, but we didn't. So I'm taking what you gave me, the good and the bad, and I'm using it to build something better for the women who come after me, for the daughters who deserve fathers who see them from the start. I straightened my coat, squared my shoulders. I have to go. I have a breakfast meeting with the Chief of Naval Operations tomorrow. We're discussing the next generation of information warfare strategy. Big decisions. Lives in the balance. The kind of work you never thought I'd do. I smiled, but I'm doing it, and I'm doing it well. I started to walk away, then stopped and looked back. You introduced me wrong once, Dad, but I introduced myself correctly every day after, and that made all the difference. I saluted, sharp and precise. Then I turned and walked back to my car, carrying his memory and my own. Hard-won certainty that I'd earned every single step of the journey. The cemetery gates were closing as I drove out. In my rearview mirror, I could see the headstones disappearing into darkness. Row after row of service members who'd given everything they had. My father was among them now, and someday I would be too, but not yet. I still had work to do. That's how his little clerk became the admiral he never saw coming. What about you? Have you ever had to fight to be truly seen, to prove your worth to someone who refused to acknowledge it? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below.